The official United States Army Air Force report for Mission 47, flown on March 1, 1943, is a masterpiece of bureaucratic understatement. Classified secret and stamped with a routing number, it sits today in the National Archives, a brittle piece of paper in a gray cardboard box. It contains coordinates, squadron designations, bomb types, and fuel loads. It lists in tidy columns the results: 888 enemy transport sunk, 44 enemy destroyers sunk, 44B-25 aircraft lost. It is a document of dry facts, a clinical autopsy of a battle. It contains no sound, captures no. It does not tell you what it meant to be a man named Ed Lner, age 31, standing on the rain-slicked coral of 7 Mile Strip at Port Moresby in the pre-dawn gloom, staring at a B-25 Mitchell bomber and knowing, in the pit of his soul, that the numbers had turned against them. It does not tell you that the war in the Pacific was being lost, one missed bomb at a time, at 10,000 feet. The mathematics were simple, cold, and lethal. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped from high altitude took 37 seconds to. In those 37 seconds, a Japanese destroyer making 30 knots could travel over 380 yards. You were quite literally aiming at where the ship used to be. For 8 brutal months, the B-17 flying fortresses of the 5th Air Force had tried. Their bombardiers were the best in the world, peering through the precision optics of the Norden bomb sight, a device so secret it was carried onto planes in a black bag. They would fly through monsoons of flak, hold formation as zeros slashed in with cannon fire, and release on command. Back at base, the strike photos would show perfect, tight clusters of explosions. Beautiful patterns in empty ocean right next to the ships. The hit rate was 3%, 3. For every 100 bombs dropped, 97 were just expensive geysers. The Japanese sailors would look up, watch the silver specks high above, calmly turn their ships, and steam on. Every bomb that missed was a tragedy of logistics. It had been mined, forged, shipped across the Pacific. Every bomb that missed meant another load of troops, another shipment of rice and ammunition, would reach the Japanese garrison at Lee on the north coast of New Guinea. And every soldier that reinforced Lee would have to be dug out by the Australians and Americans in the jungle with blood and mud and malaria. The Allied command was staring at a slow, grinding arithmetic of attrition they could not win. Into this crisis stepped a man who thought like a mechanic, not a general. Major General George Churchill Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force, was a short, pugnacious innovator who hated paperwork and loved airplanes. He'd walk the flight lines, talking to crew chiefs and sergeants, asking what if. He looked at the problem not as a tactician, but as a tinkerer. The high-altitude doctrine was sacred. It was what the Air Force had been built for. Kenny looked at it and saw a broken machine. If the bomb took too long to fall, the solution wasn't better aiming. It was to not let it fall at all. He proposed something that sounded, to every seasoned pilot who heard it, like a suicide note. Skip it, he said, like a flat stone on a pond. Fly in on the deck, 50 feet above the water. Release 300 yards out. Let the momentum carry it into the side of the ship. It'll skip once, maybe twice, and slam right into the hull. The theorists crunched numbers and said it was possible. The pilots, men who had felt the concussive slam of flak and seen tracers float lazily up before accelerating past their canopy, thought it was insane. Flying a medium bomber, a plane the size of a small house, at 270 miles an hour, 50 feet above the waves, straight at a warship bristling with guns, violated every instinct of self-preservation. In those 3 hours, the pilots gathered around chalkboards, not maps. They were not plotting a course, they were solving a physics problem. Altitude, 50 feet. Not 60, not 40. Speed, 270 mph. Release point, 300 yards. Fuse delay, 5 seconds. Each variable was a link in a chain. Break one, and the chain snapped. Come in at 70 feet, and the bomb would skip clean over the ship. Come in at 40, and you might hit a wave and cartwheel. Release at 400 yards, and the bomb would lose momentum and sink. Release at 200, and you'd fly into your own explosion. They were turning their aircraft into precise guided weapons, and the guidance system was their own nerve. They were quantifying courage. Each pilot was assigned a specific ship. Transport 1, Transport 2 down the line. The destroyers, faster and more dangerous, were secondary targets. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. One bomber, one pass, one bomb. There would be no second chances, no orbiting for another run. You got one shot at a football field moving at 30 knots, with dozens of guns trying to blow you out of the sky. At 7:15, they walked to their plane. The ground crews, who knew every rivet and oil leak, watched them go with solemn faces. They knew. The usual pre-flight banter was absent. The ritual of checking the engines, the controls, the bomb release was performed with a religious intensity. This was not just another mission. It was an experiment, and they were the laboratory subjects. Lner climbed into the cockpit of his B-25, which someone had christened the Avenger in faded paint. His co-pilot, Lieutenant Tom Bentz, a quiet Iowan, was already running through the checklist. In the makeshift gunner's position in the nose, Staff Sergeant Carl Walls checked and rechecked the bomb release cable. No one spoke. Words were useless. The roar of the first engine cracking to life broke the tension. Then another, and another, until the entire strip was vibrating with a raw, mechanical thunder. One by one, the Mitchells taxied onto the coral runway, their twin tails silhouetted against the rising sun. Lner looked down the line at the faces in the other cockpit. Foss Fawcett gave him a thumbs up. Bill Hayes, a former car mechanic from Ohio, nodded grimly. They were not a formation. They were a brotherhood of the damned, bound by a secret they all now shared. At 7:45, Lner released the brakes and pushed the throttles forward. The Avenger surged ahead, the coral grit pinging against the fuselage. The tail lifted, and then they were airborne, the green jungle and the blue sea spreading out beneath them. He immediately dipped the nose, descending not to cruising altitude, but to wave-top height. The other B-25s followed, tucking in behind and to the sides. They stayed low, at 30 feet, so low that salt spray from the whitecaps misted their windscreens. This was their first act of defiance. They were flying beneath Japanese radar coverage. They were a ghost flight, skimming the surface of the sea, invisible. The 90-minute flight to the Bismarck Sea was a study in silent tension. There was no radio chatter. The Japanese monitored every frequency. Surprise was their only real weapon. Lner's world shrank to his instruments, the horizon, and the two other planes in his flight. The ocean was a vast, empty blue desert. Navigation was dead reckoning. An error of a few degrees would mean missing the convoy entirely. They were flying on faith toward a spot on a map where intelligence said the enemy would be. Inside the roaring cabin, each man was alone with his thoughts. Lner thought of the reports, the denials, the word reckless. He thought about the 7,000 men on those transports, most of them probably scared kids, just like the men in his squadron. This was the horrible calculus of command. You had to think of the enemy as a number to be erased, to save your own men from becoming a number later. At 852, the horizon ceased to be empty. He was a machine inputting variables. 600 yards. The transport filled the entire windscreen. He could see the shocked faces of soldiers staring up, see the gleam of an officer's sword. Every cell in his body, every evolutionary instinct forged over 1,000,000 years, screamed at him to pull back on the yoke, to climb, to escape the mountain of steel hurtling toward him. He overrode it all. 400 yards, bomb-armed. Wall's voice, sharp in his headset. 300 yards. Lner's thumb found the release button on the yoke. He didn't press it, he willed it. He felt the heavy thunk through the airframe as the 1,000-pound bomb dropped free. The Avenger, suddenly lighter, lurched upward. Lner didn't watch it go. He was already hauling back on the yoke with all his strength, fighting the G-force, aiming for the patch of clear sky above the transport's mast. Behind and below, the bomb hit the water. It did not sink. It struck the surface at a shallow angle, like a stone expertly thrown. It skipped, once a graceful lethal bounce, and vanished under the curve of the ship's hull. The 5-second delay fuse ticked down inside the dark, cold water. Then the world blew apart. The explosion was not a sound. It was a physical entity. A fist of compressed air and water that slammed into the Avenger's belly, kicking its tail high and throwing it into a sickening, sideways slide. Lner fought the controls, his muscles straining against the chaos. In his peripheral vision, a column of flame and black debris erupted from the transport's midsection, punching through the deck in a cataclysm of torn steel. A secondary explosion, deeper and more visceral, rumbled through the ship's guts, the ammunition or fuel stores cooking off. The transport didn't just list, it buckled, its back broken, as a gaping hole swallowed the sea. Men, tiny and dark, poured from its decks like ants from a kicked nest, splashing into water already shimmering with oil and fire. One bomb. 15 seconds from release to carnage. The skip bomb had worked. It had worked perfectly, but there was no time for triumph, not even for a breath. The sky was now a lethal canvas. To his right, Fawcett's B-25 was pulling up, a trail of smoke from its target. Another transport, flames licking up its foremast. To his left, Captain Bill Hayes had taken on a destroyer. His bomb had skipped twice, a double tap on the water, before smashing into the destroyer's stern. The effect was even more dramatic. The back third of the warship simply ceased to exist in a flash of white-orange. What remained nose down, the stern rising high out of the water as it began its swift, fatal dive. The sea was littered with sinking geometry. But the Japanese Navy was not some static target. It was a living, thinking beast, and it had just been stung. It reacted with terrifying speed and discipline. A destroyer on the far flank, untouched by the initial chaos, swung its main batteries with cool precision. It ignored the burning transports. It fixed its gaze on the low-flying bombers. Its guns fired not at where they were, but at where they would be. The shells walked across the water with mathematical malevolence. The first missed Lieutenant Tom Mitchell's B-25 by 50 yards, the second by 20. The third did not miss. It struck Mitchell's aircraft amidships. There was no drama, no lingering fire. The bomber, its own bomb still in its bay, vanished. One moment it was a silhouette against the smoke. The next it was an expanding ball of silent flame that instantly collapsed into a shower of metal confetti and a boiling pillar of black smoke. No parachutes. No debris large enough to be called wreckage. 5 men erased. The war had granted them no narrative, no heroic last stand. Just an instantaneous conversion from life to statistics. Lner saw it happen in a frozen sliver of time, a horrifying postscript to his own success. He had no time to feel it. Grief was a luxury that got you killed. It was the one thing Lner had forbidden. A second pass gave the enemy time to think, to aim. The destroyer Jensen had mistracked his turn with predatory patience. Its guns waited. As Jensen came back around, lining up for his second attempt, the destroyer filled his windscreen. The first shell took his port engine clean off. The second entered the cockpit. Jensen's B-25 simply ceased to fly. It rolled onto its back, a dead thing, and hammered into the sea at 300 miles per hour. There was no explosion, just the final brutal punctuation of impact. 2 bombers lost Keltoskes. The exchange was brutal, but the convoy was dying. 7 transports were now definitively sinking. 3 destroyers crippled. The battle had raged for barely 8 minutes. And then, at 9:15, the sky above the scattered clouds came alive. 0 fighters, 18 of them, sleek and silver, dropped like falcons. They had been there all along, high cover, waiting. The American P-38 Lightnings assigned to keep them busy were outnumbered, drawn away, or already engaged. Something in the air cover plan had frayed. The Zeros fell upon the vulnerable bombers with a terrifying hunger. Lner, nursing his damaged Avenger, low on fuel and ammunition, saw them coming. He pushed the throttles forward and dove even lower, to 20 feet, then 15. Propellers were so close they churned salt spray into a mist around the cockpit. He was skimming the waves, a fleeing duck trying to become a fish. The Zeros split. Half climbed to re-engage the scattering P-38s. The other 9 focused on the kill, the slow, heavy-wounded B-25s. They attacked with controlled fury, making high-speed passes, their twin-team cannons blasting shells that walked across the water before reaching for the bombers. Tracer fire arced past Lner's cannon, jinked left, then right, a violent, ungainly dance at wave-top height, making his plane a hard target. In the dorsal turret, Staff Sergeant Tommy Blake fired short, disciplined bursts, not to hit, but to deter, to make a Zero pilot think twice about lining up a steady shot. It worked for a moment. The Zero broke off, but behind them, Paul Warren's damaged bomber, with its charred wing, was not so lucky. The Zero pilot, cool and expert, latched onto its tail. Warren threw his plane into every evasive maneuver his wounded bird could manage, climbs that bled precious speed, dives that stressed the damaged spar, banking turns that felt like the wings would tear off. The Zero stayed with him, patient, a shadow. He waited until Warren, in a climbing turn, bled off his last knot of airspeed and hung, for a fatal second, almost stalled. Then he fired, a 2-second burst from his cannons. Warren's starboard engine exploded. The bomber nosed over, silent and dead, and plowed into the sea. This time, Lner saw 3 parachutes blossom, 3 white flowers against the blue and black. 3 out of 5. It felt, bizarrely, like a victory. The Zeros pressed their attack for 6 more minutes. Then, abruptly, they peeled away and clawed for altitude. The reason became clear. The high-altitude B-17s were returning for a second bomb run. The Japanese fighters had to choose: mop up the damaged low-level attackers or defend what was left of their convoy from the high bombers. They chose the convoy. The respite was immediate. Lner used it to take stock. His port engine was running rough, oil pressure fluctuating. His fuel gauges dipped towards half. He looked back at the battlefield. This stretch of ocean they had turned into a junkyard. Of the 8 transports, 7 were clearly going down or already gone. The 8th was a burning hulk, making a desperate, limping run for the distant New Britain coast. All 4 destroyers on the screen were damaged. 2 were dead in the water, the other 2 circling the dying transports, trying to pluck survivors from the oil-slick water. Battle of the Bismarck Sea, the main event, was over. It had lasted 11 minutes. Pilots and crews who flew repeated low-level attack missions had shorter operational lifespans. They weren't just being shot down more, they were being broken down more. The term combat fatigue was used, but it felt inadequate. These men had flown into the teeth of defenses that high-altitude crews only saw as distant puffs of black smoke. For 30 seconds on every run, they were the center of the universe for every Japanese gunner on a ship. They saw tracers float up, then accelerate, then converge on them. They saw the faces on the decks. They flew through the debris of their own wingmen. The psychological toll of that repeated, intimate brush with death was corrosive. They would return to base with a hollow-eyed stare, hands that shook not from fear, but from a kind of systemic overload. They had nightmares not of crashing, but of the approach, the endless, slow-motion rush toward an unmoving ship, a dream from which they could never wake up before impact. The courage required was not the brief, explosive courage of a charge, but the sustained cold courage of holding a course, of being a willing target. It was a courage that could burn out a man's soul. The Army Air Forces, pragmatic as ever, responded by rotating these men out sooner. They became a specialist elite, used heavily, and then sent home before they shattered completely. The human cost was factored in, managed, but never truly eliminated. Across the world, the idea propagated. The British, desperate to counter the German U-boat threat and interdict coastal shipping in the English Channel and off Norway, sent observers to the Pacific. They came back with reports of the American low-level method. The Royal Air Force adapted it, fitting their powerful twin-engine Beaufighters and later Mosquitoes with bombs and rockets. The results in the narrow fjords and coastal routes of Europe mirrored the Pacific experience. Spectacular successes and harrowing losses. A Beaufighter skimming the wavetops at dusk to surprise a German convoy was just as vulnerable to light flak as a B-25 was. But the payoff, a stopped ship blocking a vital channel, a munitions barge vaporized, was worth the risk. The Germans, in turn, learned to add more flak-fearing, quadruple 20M mounts to their merchantmen, turning every tramp steamer into a porcupine. The Soviets, ever direct, attempted their own version with Lend-Lease B-25s and their own Il-2 ground attack aircraft. Their technique was often brutally simple: come in even lower with heavier bombs and accept the losses. They lacked the finesse of the American suppressive fire doctrine, and their casualty rates reflected it. But in the brutal calculus of the Eastern Front, where human life was a currency spent with chilling profligacy, if it sank a German troopship, it was justified. By 1944, the tactic had evolved beyond its simple, desperate origin. It was no longer just about a single B-25 making a lone run. American doctrine now layered the attacks. First, high-altitude B-24 liberators would drop sticks of bombs to force the convoy to scatter and maneuver, disrupting their formation. Then, fighter sweeps of P-38s or P-47s would strafe the decks, silencing anti-aircraft guns and drawing fire. Finally, the skip-bombing B-25s would strike from multiple directions at wavetop height while the defenders were distracted and disorganized. It was a symphony of destruction, with each movement playing a part to set up the killing blow. The B-25 Michel itself was transformed. The commerce destroyer versions that rolled off the North American aviation lines in late 1943 and 1944 were beasts Lner would scarcely recognize. The solid nose packed not 4, but 8.50 caliber machine guns. Some had 4 more in cheek blisters and a pair in a top turret, bringing the total forward-firing armament to 14 guns. The deeper human truths lay dormant, buried in personal letters, in unpublished diaries, in the memories of the men who were there, most of whom, like Lner, chose to keep those memories locked away. It wasn't until much later, when a new generation of historians began to seek out the veterans themselves to practice what we now call oral history, that the fuller picture began to emerge. The fear, the moral ambiguity, the trauma, these were not signs of weakness to be airbrushed away, but integral parts of the historical truth. They were what made the courage meaningful. A man who feels no fear performs no act of bravery. Somunds, no act of bravery. It is in the overcoming of that visceral animal terror that heroism resides. Lner's story, when finally pieced together from squadron records, after-action reports, and the few reluctant comments he made late in life to a researcher, embodies this complete truth. He was not a swashbuckling ace. He was a competent, frustrated officer pushed to the brink by a failing strategy, who made a hard choice and then lived with the unbearable weight of its consequences, both the victory and the cost. His later life was a quiet testament to that weight. He was active in his community, in his children's lives, but there was a part of him that was permanently elsewhere. He would sometimes stand at the back window of his Sacramento home, looking at the horizon for long minutes, seeing not the backyard fence and the neighbor's peach tree, but an endless expanse of blue water under a tropical sun. He had no hatred for the Japanese. In his later years, he would watch documentaries about the war and see the aging faces of former Japanese soldiers and feel a strange, sad kinship. They too had been young men sent into a machine of unimaginable violence. They too had done things they wished they could forget. The war, for him, was not a contest of nations, but a shared human catastrophe that he had survived. His quiet retirement, his refusal to be a war hero, was perhaps his final act of integrity. He would not allow his complex, painful experience to be simplified into a patriotic anecdote. He had done his duty. That was the beginning and the end of it for him. When he passed away in 1997, the local paper's brief obituary noted his service and his family. It did not mention the Bismarck Sea. His children, honoring his wishes, kept his medals and his logbooks in a small box in the attic. They knew he had been in the war, that he had flown bombers, that he didn't like to talk about it. The full measure of what he had done and what had been done to him was buried with him. And so, the story of the Bismarck Sea and the birth of skip bombing exists in 2 parallel streams. There is the official history, a tale of tactical innovation and decisive victory told in books and documentaries, and there is the human history, a story of fear, choice, sacrifice, and silent burden, carried in the hearts of men like Ed Lner until they carried it to their graves. One is clean, instructive, a lesson in military science. The other is messy, emotional, a lesson in the human condition under extreme duress. Both are true. But only one has the power to make us understand not just what happened, but what it felt like to be there, in that cockpit at 50 feet with the world about to explode. The legacy of a battle is often measured in the changes it forces upon the world, in the invisible lines that are redrawn on maps and in the minds of strategists. The Bismarck Sea did that. But its deeper, more enduring legacy was etched into the very metal of the aircraft that fought it and into the doctrinal DNA of the air forces that followed. The B-25 Mitchell, already a workhorse, was reborn in the fires of that engagement. North American aviation plants, running at a relentless pace, began producing specialized variants specifically for the low-level anti-shipping role. The B-25G was the first, of Frankenstein's monster of an airplane with the bombardier's nose replaced by a fixed, forward-firing 75 mm4 cannon, the heaviest weapon ever mounted on an American bomber. It was less a precision instrument and more a sledgehammer. A pilot would line up a ship, his co-pilot acting as gunner, and fire a single massive 15-pound high-explosive shell. The recoil was violent, slowing the aircraft by almost 60 miles per hour in an instant. It was terrifying to fire and devastating to hit. But it was the B-25H and later the B-25J that truly became the apostles of the skip bombing doctrine. These models could be configured with a solid nose crammed with 8 50 caliber machine guns, a veritable battery of death that could suppress or destroy any target afloat. Some squadrons experimented with packages of forward-firing rockets under the wings, adding a standoff punch before the final bomb run. The Michelle became a modular weapons platform, a testament to the urgent, pragmatic innovation that characterized the Pacific Air War. It was no longer just a bomber. It was a strafer, a gunship, a skip bomber. Its very identity had been rewritten by the needs of that one morning in March 1943. This evolution was not without its costs, and not all were paid in the air. On the home front, the pressure to produce these modified wonders was immense. In Kansas City and Inglewood, women and men who had never seen the ocean worked around the clock, riveting skins, installing gun mounts, wiring bomb release. They were building tools for a specific brutal kind of killing, a fact they pushed from their minds as they focused on the serial number, on the quota, on the proud knowledge that their plane might be the one to turn the tide. They sent these machines off into the world with a mix of pride and profound ignorance. They did not know the smell of cordite in a tropical cockpit. They did not know what it was like to see the intricate welding on a ship's hull fill your windscreen at 270 miles per hour. They built the weapon, but the men like Lner had to discover its soul, its terrifying intimacy. And as the modified Mitchells flowed into the Pacific theater, they carried with them the implicit lessons of the Bismarck Sea, lessons written not in manuals, but in survivors' lore. New pilots would be taken under the wing of a veteran who had flown the early missions. The training was not about the theory of the skip. It was about the feel. "You'll want to pull up," the veteran would say, his eyes distant. "Your hands will beg you to pull up. Don't." You hold her steady, you watch the tracers come up slow, then fast, and you keep that damn ship in your sights like it's the only thing in the world. And when your gut says now, you wait one more second, then you release. It was an oral tradition of near-death experiences, passed down like folklore. They learned the tricks, how to use the sun, how to coordinate with the strafing fighters, how to jink just enough to throw off the gunners without spoiling the bomb run. Without spoiling the bomb. They learned the grim mathematics. A destroyer's main guns could traverse so many degrees per second. You had a window of about 8 seconds from the time they spotted you until their shells could track you at low level. They learned that a transport loaded with troops would often explode with a different, more lurid fireball than one loaded with vehicles. This was the unvarnished, brutal curriculum of the skip bomber, a school where the final exam was often fatal. And the Japanese, for their part, engaged in a desperate, adaptive dance. Their ship designers and captains were not passive victims. After the Bismarck Sea, a new urgency infected the Imperial Japanese Navy's approach to anti-aircraft defense. The priceless resource of combat experience, the survivors pulled from the oil-slick water, was mined for every detail. What angle did the bombers come from? How low exactly? Did they strafe first? This intelligence was distilled into new training manuals and tactical bulletins. Ships already in service were refitted wherever possible. The sleek, deadly destroyers, once designed for torpedo attacks and fleet actions, found their decks cluttered with additional 25-96 anti-aircraft guns in single, double, and even triple mounts. These weapons, while lacking the hitting power of the big 127B guns, could put up a staggering volume of fire at close range. A wall of steel designed specifically to shred low-flying aircraft. The transports and merchant vessels, the vulnerable hearts of the convoys, were given whatever light guns could be spared, often manned by soldiers rather than sailors. Convoy routing became an art of evasion. They traveled under cover of weather fronts, clung to coastlines, and moved primarily at night. When fighter cover from land bases was possible, it was deployed aggressively. The Zero, for all its later war vulnerabilities, was still a deadly interceptor in the hands of an experienced pilot, and a flight of Zeros diving on B-25s during their vulnerable approach could break up an attack entirely. The Japanese also developed a chilling counter-tactic of their own, the deliberate sacrifice. A destroyer or even a smaller vessel would sometimes steam directly towards an incoming skip bombing formation, forcing the bombers to jink or release early. while its concentrated fire aimed to take down the leader. It was a recognition that the low-level attack was a duel, and sometimes you had to close to knife-fight range to win. This constant adaptation meant that no skip bombing mission after March 1943 was a repeat of the first. The Americans never again caught a convoy so completely by surprise, so psychologically unprepared for the attack profile. Every subsequent mission was a duel between an evolving tactic and an adapting defense. The victories were still frequent, but they were increasingly expensive, bought with sharper teeth and harder metal. This dynamic played out across the vast canvas of the Pacific. In the Solomons around New Guinea, and later in the Philippines and the South China Sea, the skip bombers of the 5th and 13th Air Forces became the scourge of Japanese coastal shipping. They hunted not just convoys, but any vessel daring enough to move in daylight. They attacked ships in harbors at anchor, where the skip bomb was particularly lethal, as the target had no room to maneuver. The November 2, 1943, raid on Rabaul Harbor, mentioned in passing earlier, was the apotheosis of this refined doctrine. 38 B-25s, supported by a maelstrom of fighter cover and preceded by distracting high-level raids, swept into the fortified harbor. They struck at transports, warships, and auxiliaries trapped in the confined water. The result was pandemonium and devastation. A heavy cruiser was sunk at its moorings. A destroyer was split in half. The harbor was left a smoking junkyard. American losses were minimal. It was proof that the tactic, when executed with overwhelming force and surprise against a fixed target, was unstoppable. But for every Rabaul, there was a costly grind. During the campaign to isolate the Japanese stronghold of Truk, skip bombers faced a hornet's nest of flak and fighters. Missions there were described by veterans as flying through a rainbow of tracers, every color representing a different caliber of Japanese gun. The losses mounted, but so did the sunk tonnage. The tactic became a blunt instrument of siege, hammering the isolated garrisons into logistical starvation. The human element of this relentless pressure war is often lost. Consider not just the pilots, but the men in the back, the navigators, the engineers, the gunners. In the modified B-25s, the navigator's role often vanished. The pilot was the bombardier. The flight engineer became a vital extra set of eyes, watching for fighters, calling out damage, managing the screaming engines. The gunners, particularly the one in the top turret and the tail, lived in a world of violent gyrations. As the pilot jinked at wave-top height, the gunners were thrown about in their plexiglass bubbles, trying to track fast-moving fighters that flashed past in a blur. The tail gunner, in his lonely position at the very end of the aircraft, had perhaps the most terrifying job. During the run, he was staring directly back at the target they had just hit or missed. He saw the explosions, the flak bursts chasing them, the fate of the planes behind. He was the one who often confirmed a kill or witnessed a friend's demise, a silent spectator to the consequences of their action. And after the bombs were gone and the guns fell silent, it was the crew's collective nerve that held the damaged aircraft together on the long, anxious flight home, nursing failing engines, watching fuel gauges dip, praying the patchwork repairs would hold. The camaraderie was absolute, forged in shared terror. They developed a black, necessary humor. A crew that returned with hundreds of holes in their plane might name it the screen door. A pilot who consistently brought them back might be called lucky, a nickname that was both a compliment and a talisman against pushing that luck too far. This micro-society inside each bomber was the true engine of the war effort, a fragile human machine operating at the very edge of its endurance. Meanwhile, in the rarefied world of high command and Allied cooperation, the ripples of the Bismarck Sea spread. The success of skip bombing was a powerful data point in inter-Allied discussions. When British Air Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris, a devout believer in the strategic level bombing of cities, questioned the diversion of resources to anti-shipping strikes, proponents could point to the Pacific and say, "Look what it accomplishes." The tactic gave tangible, immediate results. Ships sunk, supplies blocked, campaigns shortened. It was a concrete argument for tactical air power in a war often dominated by strategic debates. For the Australians, who fought alongside the Americans in New Guinea and who provided the crucial bowfighters strafing support in the Bismarck Sea battle, the success validated their own focus on ground support and maritime strike. Their aircraft and tactics were perfectly suited to the low-level, brutal warfare of the Southwest Pacific, and the American adoption of similar methods created a powerful synergy. The shared experience of those March days forged a deep bond between the squadrons, a respect that transcended the usual Allied formalities. An American pilot knew that when the Australian bows went in first, they were drawing fire, sacrificing themselves to make his job possible. That debt was acknowledged silently in the mess halls and in the shared weary nods after a mission. As the war ground towards its conclusion, the skip-bombing B-25 found a new, even more terrifying role: the attack on Japan itself. During the bombing campaign against the Japanese home islands, B-25s were sometimes used in low-level strikes against coastal targets, shipping in the inland sea, and even industrial sites. Flying at night or in poor weather, they would skip bombs into factories situated on coastlines or river mouths. But the most psychologically impactful use came in the form of the commerce raider missions. Flying from liberated islands like Iwo Jima, B-25s would roam the sea lanes around Japan, hunting the last desperate remnants of Japanese merchant shipping. These missions were often solitary, long-range hunts. A single B-25 armed with bombs and its formidable nose guns would stalk a lone freighter or a small coaster. The attack was intimate, merciless. The Japanese, by 1945, had almost no air cover left, and their ships were defenseless. For the American crews, it was less a battle and more an execution. And some spoke later of the strange, unsettling quiet of these missions, broken only by the roar of their own engines and the crump of their bombs. They could see the faces of the men on the decks, see them scrambling, see the ship die slowly. It was a far cry from the chaotic, flak-filled skies of the 1943 convoy battles. This was the endgame of the strategy the Bismarck Sea had heralded: the complete annihilation of an island nation's ability to sustain itself by sea. The skip bomb had begun as a desperate solution to a tactical problem. But is this? By 1945, it had become an instrument of strategic strangulation. When the peace finally came, the sound of engines faded. The B-25s, those tough, adaptable birds, were flown to vast boneyards in the Philippines and on Pacific atolls. Propellers were removed, engines were pickled in cosmoline, and they were left to sit in long, orderly rows under the sun and rain. Most were eventually chopped up for scrap aluminum, their metal recycled into pots, pans, and the skeletons of new cars. A precious few were saved, donated to museums, or sold for a few $100s to crop dusters and bush pilots. The specialized gun noses were stripped out, the bomb racks removed. The warplane was demilitarized, turned back into a simple machine. The men, too, were demobilized. They took off their uniforms, packed up their duffel bags, and boarded ships for home. They carried with them the memories, the skills, and the silent wounds. Many, like Lner, sought quiet lives. Others found the peace more difficult. The man who could hold a bomber steady through a storm of flak might find himself unable to hold a steady job. The camaraderie of the crew was replaced by the isolation of civilian life. The intense life-or-death purpose of war gave way to the mundane anxieties of peacetime. Some talked, spinning war stories at the American Legion Hall. Most, however, kept their counsel. They had learned that words could not bridge the gap between their experience and the understanding of those who hadn't been there. They became a generation of quiet men, their greatest battles fought internally long after the last shot was fired. And what of the tactic itself? With the dawn of the jet age and the invention of guided missiles, skip bombing became an immediate anachronism. Why risk a multi-million-dollar jet at 50 feet when a missile could be launched from over the horizon? The romance of the low-level attack was supplanted by the cold efficiency of silicon and radar. The last official use of anything resembling skip bombing was likely in the early Cold War, with specialized aircraft like the B-26 Invader in Korea. But even that was a shadow of the massed, desperate raids of the Pacific. The tactic retired along with the men who perfected it. It exists now only in history books, in flight simulators, and in the fading memories of the very old. But its principles, the value of surprise, the psychological impact of low-level attack, the necessity of suppressing fire, were absorbed into modern air combat doctrine. The spirit of the skip bomber, the willingness to take a tremendous risk for a decisive payoff, lives on in the pilots who fly Nap of the Earth missions, in the SEAL teams that conduct lightning raids. In any warrior who understands that sometimes the safest path is straight through the heart of danger, the story of the Bismarck Sea, then, is not just a tale of a forgotten battle. It is a case study in military innovation under pressure. It is a testament to the courage of the average man placed in an unbearable situation. And it is a somber reminder that every revolutionary tactic, every war-winning strategy, is ultimately delivered by individuals who must stare into the abyss and then fly directly into it. The true end of the story lies not in the archives or shine is a trillionsor, but in the quiet, persistent echo of that morning's choice. Long after the last B-25 was melted down, after the last veteran passed away, the decision made by Ed Lner in the humid Port Moresby ops tent continues to resonate. It becomes a parable for any moment where the established way is leading to failure, and the only way forward is a terrifying, forbidden gamble. We see it in the engineer who bypasses a failing protocol to save a mission, in the doctor who tries an untested procedure when the standard one has failed, in the ordinary person who stands up when everyone else is following a broken script. The skip bombing run is a metaphor for the human capacity to innovate under existential pressure, to look at a flat stone and see not a child's toy, but the key to an impossible lock. But the parable is incomplete without its full cost. The innovation came wrapped in sacrifice. Tom Mitchell and his crew vaporized in an instant, Harold Jensen turning for a second pass he never completed. The Japanese gunners on the ships, the young soldiers in the transports, thousands of them, drowning in the oily water or strafed in their lifeboats. The psychic scars borne by the survivors, both Allied and Japanese, that never fully healed. The story demands we hold both truths in our hands at once, the brilliant success and the horrific price. One does not cancel out the other, they are intertwined, the light and the shadow of the same event. To celebrate the tactic while ignoring the cost is to turn history into a video game. To focus only on the cost and ignore the desperate necessity that birthed the action is to judge from the comfort of a peace that such actions help to win. So why do you and I, sift through these dusty records and piece together these fragmented memories? It is not to glorify war. It is to retrieve the full human dimension from the simplifying jaws of history. Ed Lner did not want to be a hero. He wanted to be effective. He wanted the deaths of his men to mean something. In his silent retirement, in his refusal to be a talisman of victory, he was perhaps guarding this very truth, that what happened was too complex, too stained with tragedy and ambiguity, to be worn as a badge. He understood that the real monument was not a statue or a named building, but the simple, unadorned fact that he and his men, when faced with an impossible equation, solved it. They did not solve it cleanly, they solved it with blood, fire, and courage that bordered on madness. The wreck of the SS Pruth, the old steamer they used for secret practice, still lies on the Taro Reef off Port Moresby. Coral encrusts its rusted bones. Fish dart through its shattered holds. It is a quiet, forgotten place. There is no plaque to mark it as the proving ground for a tactic that changed a war. The ocean, as it always does, has absorbed the evidence, smoothed it over, returned it to nature. The Bismarck Sea itself, a vast blue expanse between New Guinea and New Britain, shows no sign of the carnage that once painted its surface with fire and oil. The sea forgets. It is our job, the job of the living, to remember. Not just the names and the dates, but the feel of the decision, the weight of the consequence, the echo of the engine roar, and the terrible, beautiful, tragic arc of a skipping bomb. We remember so we can understand the price of the world we inhabit. We remember so that men like Ed Lner, who asked for no remembrance, are not finally, completely, swallowed by the same silence that followed them home from the war. We tell the story so that the flat stone, skipping across the water of history, causes ripples that never quite die away.